Choosing your first Pokemon is always a tough choice, but what if you actually chose the worst one? In this video, we'll be going over which starter is actually the worst competitively in each generation. This means that we're going to compare their competitive performances to each other's in the generation that they were released in, and we are not going to judge them by their careers across all generations. Additionally, we are not looking at Megaforms or Eevee and Pikachu, and we're going to start with Blastoise in the first generation. This is kind of a funny case. With the Psychic and normal domination of OU, the most iconic starters don't fit into standard play. They don't really work in UU either. NU, however, has come to be known as the starter tier, and that's where all three of them have wound up. And not only that, but Charizard is incredible there, and one of the best Pokemon around. Meanwhile, Blastoise is also excellent, in large part for how well it takes on Charizard. Venusaur has its niche, but all in all, it's not great. In fact, it's not even officially NU. So why on earth is Blastoise actually the worst starter in Gen 1? Well, while Venusaur is unquestionably the worst of the three in the NU tier, if we look to standard play, which can be argued to be a more accurate assessment of the Pokemon's overall ability, then Venusaur is unquestionably the best of the three. Think of it like how Quagsire regularly defies its tiering status and appears in OU, or even Ubers. This makes it a much better overall Pokemon than the Pokemon it actually shares its tiering status with. So how is it that Venusaur manages to be the best of the Kanto starters in a metagame famously dominated by Psychics, while Victreebel, a Pokemon of similar typing, manages it just fine thanks to the incredible impact of Sleep Powder, Auto Crit Stab Razor Leaf, and Swords Dance alongside a good attack stat for powerful Hyper Beams if it so chooses, and most of all, the highly controversial Wrap. Venusaur doesn't have Wrap, but it does have all the rest that we just mentioned. It even has the same special stat as Victreebel, so its Razor Leafs hit equally hard. And since it also has the same HP stat, they take special hits just as well, which is to say, they're crucially not one-hit KO'd by Psychic and Blizzard. So that's why Venusaur is the best of the three. It's not good, no, not at all, but the fact is that it can imitate much of what makes Victreebel good incredibly accurately, and that beats out the other two by a long shot. Charizard isn't good either. You'd only ever use it for the thrill of reminiscing on how you and your Charmander have come so far over the years. Its niche is gimmicky through and through, but as far as gimmicks go, it's a pretty interesting one and quite fun. It's the fastest Swords Dancer in Gen 1, and it shares its speed tier with the mighty Zapdos, so it's getting the jump on a fair bit, meaning it can potentially Swords Dance Hyper Beam to decent effect. It pairs this with the immediacy of a powerful stab Fire Blast that packs a 30% burn chance in Gen 1, so it can threaten the likes of Exeggutor right off the bat. Charizard is a strange mixture of Kingler and Moltres, with Zapdos tier speed. Yeah, it's a real sleeper pick just waiting to rearrange Gen 1 in its image. Jokes aside, you could do worse, like Blastoise, which can't do anything. Blastoise is basically Vaporeon, which also can't do anything. Being a generic water type offers very little in Gen 1's normal psychic-laden landscape. It doesn't switch into much confidently, and it certainly doesn't do much of anything in return. Decent hit taking? Who cares? In a world of Starmie, Blastoise isn't going to hack it. Even putting Starmie aside, you've got Cloyster and even Lapras to contend with. The other two starters are bad, but they can still at least do something. Blastoise doesn't even have that. And Blastoise was pretty meager in a way that would be continued in the next generation, with of course Meganium, who is the Pokemon that you thought it was. Yes, it's famously the worst starter of all time and all that jazz, but actually it's not in its debut generation. In fact, it wasn't just not the worst, it was the best of the three. Oh, and it doesn't stop there. Whereas Venusaur was the best by default in that it could imitate an actual OU Pokemon, but shouldn't actually be used in OU, Meganium was the best in that it possessed a unique niche. Two, in fact, and even saw itself used occasionally by good players in serious tournament games. Meganium could either be used as a Leech Seeding wall, but Leech Seed didn't work on switches in Gen 2, so it wasn't the monstrously spammable move it became in Gen 3, but it was still effective, and Meganium could support its team with Reflect or Light Screen, which didn't just slow down mighty opponents like Snorlax or the Electrics respectively, but assisted its teammates in their own setup. Additionally, even though Razor Leaf was no longer auto-crit, Meganium wielded it well to act as one of the hardest counters to Vaporeon around, which was huge considering Vaporeon was usually one of the biggest threats to stall teams. Alternatively, Meganium could go on the offensive itself with Swords Dance, leveraging its terrible bulk and typing alongside the healing of Synthesis to boost multiple times and go for a late game sweep with Body Slam and Earthquake. That's right, Gen 2 OU was a tier where Swords Dance Meganium was viable. Gen 2 OU was also not a tier where Typhlosion was viable. It was thoroughly outclassed by the other fires. Moltres' Charcoal Sunny Day Fire Blast threatened a 2-hit KO on Snorlax. Charizard could belly drum for a terrifying late-game sweep. Houndoom's Stab Pursuit was excellent against Jinx, Gengar, Exeggutor, and Mischievous. Typhlosion had Dynamic Punch, so it couldn't be walled by Tyranitar, and could bust through Snorlax with extreme luck. Cool, but not really. It wasn't nearly strong enough overall to justify its lack of frailty. However, in spite of all these incredible flaws, Typhlosion was still far more viable than Feraligatr. Typhlosion was far too strong to be unleashed in UU, and if you squinted hard enough, you could somehow finagle a justification for it in OU. Feraligatr, on the other hand, couldn't even hack it in UU, let alone OU. Yes, it did get itself banned in spectacular fashion in NU, a tier which it completely warped in its own image, but it still couldn't match Typhlosion overall. It's afflicted with the same problem as Blastoise. It's more or less just a generic water type. It has a good attack stat, true, but very little to do with it. Forget the stab waterfall that wouldn't come until Gen 4. It also had to contend with the distinct lack of Swords Dance in its moveset. Meganium seemed to have borrowed it. Now, over the years, Feraligatr is well known for generally having the best competitive career of the Gen 2 starters, and by some margin, but in its debut, this dynamic was completely reversed in that it actually traded places with Meganium. Feraligatr marked the end of this era of relative blandness as Gen 3 would spice things up for the water and fire starter. Finally, the grass starter is the worst of the three, as Sceptile just wasn't as good as the other two. Swampert is a staple of Gen 3 OU and one of the most important Pokemon in the tier. Not only is its typing incredibly important for withstanding Tyranitar and Aerodactyl's stab rock slides while being immune to sand and neutral to earthquake, its physical bulk also allows it to withstand other physical staples in Salamence and Metagross, the latter of which has a stab meteor mash that Swampert also resists. Swampert's not just a passive wall though, which is precisely why it's so great. Even with its most defensive sets, it has an annoying knack for exerting a deceptive amount of pressure on the opponent. It even has the capacity for ferocious all-out offensive sets. Meanwhile, Blaziken is about as far from Swampert as you can get. Blaziken is all about the offense, so much so that it has a legitimate niche in OU despite being BL. Consider how the most standard team in Gen 3 OU is Skarmory, Blissey, Swampert, Tyranitar, and Gengar, and realize that these are 5 Pokemon that Blaziken completely dismantles. This in conjunction with the fact that its Fire Stab also utterly devours the slower Metagross while greatly threatening other meta staples in Jirachi and Celebi. This means that for all of Blaziken's flaws, and there are many, it always has a place for how badly it threatens the metagame's most defining, reliable defensive setup. Sceptile is also BL, but it is the worst because it can't hold a candle to Blaziken's level of viability in OU. Now, it's not bad, it has its own niche, which is unique and even somewhat decent, but it's not really great. The good stuff is really good. It shares its speed tier with Dugtrio, which not only makes it difficult to safely revenge kill, but also means it gets to jump on several major speedy targets, like Dragon Dash Tyranitar after a boost, Starmie, and a Select boosted Swampert, all of which are smacked super effectively by Sceptile's Stab Leaf Blade. This amazing speed also makes Sceptile quite the user of the Substitute Leech Seed combination, and Substitute doubles as a potential tool, which lets it get into Overgrow range for it to power up that Leaf Blade. Sceptile's problem is that it's not just frail, but it's weak. Leaf Blade is only 70 base power in Gen 3, meaning that when that high crit rate isn't kicking in, which is most of the time, it's effectively wielding Hidden Power Grass for stab. This works for Celebi because it's an all-around excellent Pokemon, but not so much for the specialized Sceptile. Even its higher base 105 special attack isn't helping it. Sceptile's got its niche, but it's limited. It even competes with the Sleep Powder and Encore packing Jumpluff as an offbeat Subseeder. Sceptile's struggles anticipated those to be faced by the grass starter in the next generation, as Torterra is the worst of the Gen 4 starters. Gen 4 had the most starter-focused OU yet, which gave the tier quite a bit of charm. Infernape was the initial star, which was basically an upgrade of Blaziken, with an incredible speed stat, while also demonstrating the excellence of new Gen 4 tools in Life Orb and close combat. With its blend of power and tremendously unique speed stat, it outsped an overpowered offense while dismantling and destroying defense. It helped that it had a tremendous move pool helping it out. Forget Hidden Power Grass, it was crushing Swampert and Suicune with Grass Knot, leaving it open to slot in Hidden Power Ice. It had so much more too. The incredible U-turn that shatters some of its best answers like Starmie and Latias, priority in both Mach Punch and Vacuum Wave, boosting in both Swords Dance and Nasty Plot, and Infernape even got Stealth Rock. Empoleon eventually proved itself every bit of Infernape's equal. Its primary claim to fame was its Sub-Pataya agility set. It overcame its lower speed that way, doing so in a way that also strengthened it for enabling the most frightening torrential water stab to date. It could also rock a third attack instead of Substitute, since it too had Grass Knot to slice through waters, and this freed up its item slot to Shuka Berry, crucially taking away Earthquake as an option against it. Eventually, its unique typing found its way into other niches, and it was excellent in all of them. Most famously, it was an amazing attacking lead that dominated a vast majority of the most common leads in OU, and could even pop up Stealth Rock to boot. It eventually eclipsed Infernape in usage and even viability. Whichever of the starters you preferred though, your choice was going to be Infernape or Empoleon, and certainly not Torterra, which couldn't muster any sort of OU viability. It's a shame because it was an excellent UU Pokemon, and a major force on both offense and defense. From its offense shredding Rock Polish set, to its offense walling specially defensive Stealth Rock set, but in OU it lagged miles behind its fellow starters in true Tortoise fashion. Torterra's issue was that its offense was not effective against OU, nor was it particularly unique. It was completely and utterly outclassed by Breloom, which also walled it thoroughly. Defensively, Torterra was just about the worst ground for the job. Its weaknesses were just too exploitable for too many Pokemon, meaning even its excellent bulk wasn't going to get the job done. The quadruple ice weakness really hurt it, and its upsides weren't really that impactful. In this respect, it was completely outdone by Gliscor, which thrived both defensively and offensively in spite of this flaw. If you wanted a grass type with a lot of weaknesses, you'd go with Celebi, which was much better overall. Note the far superior speed on both of these Pokemon, as well as the incredibly handy fighting resist. Torterra's toolkit was wonderfully suited to UU, but it couldn't hang with Infernape and Empoleon. In spite of this, Torterra was better off relative to what was to come. As in Gen 5, Samurott is the worst starter in singles, and Superior is the worst in VGC. After Gen 4 OU had two of its starters all over it, Gen 5 followed it up with a thoroughly meager trio whose offerings couldn't even cut it in UU. The best of the bunch in singles was Emboar, but it was hardly the second coming of either of its firefighting predecessors, landing in RU. There though, it was at least quite good. Its stab combination led itself to one of the tier's best choice Scarfers, not because it outran all the other Scarfers, because it couldn't even outrun everything unboosted like Aerodactyl. However, it did outrun almost everything unboosted, and the upside of this is that it did so while hitting really hard. Most Scarfers aren't packing the strength of a whopping base 123 attack stat, which beat out even Blaziken, let alone Infernape, alongside two 120 base power stab moves with excellent super effective and neutral coverage. Emboar wasn't just pure offense either. It adopted a superb physical defensive Protect Will-O-Wisp set, which became one of the metagame's best answers to the terrifying Durant and a massively difficult Pokemon to take down as a whole. Superior had the most promise of the starters, but it never received the contrary ability that made it such a vicious force in the following two gens of OU. As such, it wound up all the way down in NU. There, at the very least, it was one of the best Pokemon around. Its initially low special attack not seeming as low in the wake of the base stat total surrounding it, and its speed working overtime to compensate, as well as its strong natural bulk, which let it wield Calm Mind to great effect, and some irony, since that move would become the worst possible choice for Superior once it received Contrary. Superior was one of NU's greatest threats. Samurott shared NU with Superior, and thus it almost feels strange to call it the worst, because it was a very good Pokemon in its own right. It's just that Superior was outright elite, and Samurott couldn't match that. It was a solid water type attacker, whether mixed or all-out physical with Swords Dance. It had power, it had natural bulk, and its speed was decent, but only decent, which was its greatest drawback. This wasn't really the kind of flaw that prevented it from being viable, of course, as it was consistently one of the most popular choices for offensive teams for its ability to break through defense, especially since it delighted in taunting Alomomola, but it was what held it behind the Green Snake by some margin. And as for VGC, yeah, none of these starters saw regular notable use even in the format that was region locked to only black and white Pokemon, that being VGC 2011. And it's not hard to see why. For Emboar, there were certainly no shortage of fighting types even in the limited regional decks, competing with Conkeldurr, Scrafty, and Terrakion, who are all either stronger, faster, or have more utility, is a tall order. For Superior, competing with Amoonguss as a grass type, who was way better at taking hits and had Spore, seems impossible. And for Samurott, actually Samurott didn't have a lot of water competition in 2011, and it actually has the most impressive Worlds placement out of the three, so that just leaves Emboar and Superior. Oh wow, Emboar also has an impressive Worlds placement too, and it at least had a role as another Trick Room fighting type, but with fire coverage, which means the odd one out is Superior, with no way to make itself stand out versus Amoonguss. And again, this is before it received Contrary, but in future formats of VGC, Superior still struggles to find notable use even with that ability. And with that, Superior was quite a disappointment, much like the worst Gen 6 starter being Delphox in both singles and VGC. Superior was quite the disappointment, and you'd think after the disappointment of the Gen 5 starters, Game Freak would make sure that you could take your first Pokemon into OU, and they did do that with Greninja, but not with Delphox, who is the worst starter of Gen 6. And when you listen to what the other two starters got, you'll see exactly why Delphox falls short. Protean Greninja was already one of the greatest terrors unleashed on standard play throughout Generation 6, thanks to its Omni Stab alongside incredible speed that made the previously impressive Infernape look like it was holding an iron ball. It even had spikes to play the long game, making it even more impossible for checks like Mew and Alomomola to stand up to it. The only thing that could take it on was specially defensive Clefable, which withstood 2 Life Orb Hydro Pumps and was immune to spikes. But then Oraz came around, and the already great Greninja got gifted Gunk Shot, completely crushing Clefable, and it got itself banned to Ubers, making it the first starter to receive the ban hammer in its debut generation. Chestnut wasn't a bad Pokemon either. In fact, its own access to spikes and excellent physical bulk, alongside a solid set of resistances, meant it saw experimentation in OU. However, it was always more of a UU Pokemon, much like Torterra. It was tough to compete as a spiking Leech Seeder in a world of Ferrothorn. In UU, Chestnut was fine, if fairly heavy on the unspectacular side. It got the job done nicely with its bevy of excellent utility moves. In addition to spikes and Leech Seed, it also had a damage-inducing Protect in the form of Spiky Shield. It wasn't going to wall entire teams or anything, but it worked well. This leaves Delphox as the worst of the starters. It's also the only one of them to not learn Spikes. Coincidence? I think not. Spikes Delphox sounds incredible. Enough to usurp Chestnut? Maybe, maybe not. After all, its typing, while excellent, does leave it with the greatest vulnerabilities, as it is both weak to Stealth Rock and Pursuit, which is very tough to deal with. This doesn't stop Delphox from excelling in RU though. It's a force to be reckoned with when calm minding, and it cleans up at the drop of a hat with Choice Scarf. It does mean though that its user has to be very careful, especially because it was frail, which really exacerbates those weak points. It also means that it's not able to match Chestnut, who is less outwardly impressive, but also less likely to fall flat and is more consistent, which is reflected in its higher tiering status. What really hurts though isn't that just Delphox is quite a decent Pokemon that just happens to be the worst. It's the fact that it's also the worst in VGC as well. Again, neither of its competitors are superstars in that format. Even the fan favorite Greninja doesn't have much going for it, and it's actually Chestnut, which is quite decent. But Delphox's incredibly exploitable weakness to almost all spread moves, as well as a lack of utility, means it languishes as the most unusable. But Delphox isn't the only Pokemon on this list who is both the worst in singles and VGC. That goes to our Gen 7 representative, Decidueye. As famous as Incineroar has become for driving the calm, cool, and collected Zen Master Wolf Blick to a Travis Bickle-style breakdown, that's in the world of VGC. In singles, Incineroar is still a solid Pokemon, but the best of its generation was unquestionably Primarina, which didn't just have the highest tier in UU, it was so powerful in the tier as to achieve elite status almost solely through sheer strength, and it did this to the extent that certain players considered it problematic. Primarina's Choice Spec set packed a dual stab combination that wasn't impossible to resist, but very, very difficult to do so safely, since it not only packed Psychic for Amoonguss and Tentacruel, but it was just so strong that it threatened to muscle through most resists. If you didn't have Blissey or a very healthy Empoleon, you were in major trouble. Primarina was also a superb defensive Pokemon, because of course it was. Incineroar, on the other hand, was all the way down in NU. There, it was one of the very best Pokemon, if not the outright best, both as an offensive Swords Dancer and a defensive pivot that mimics its famous VGC antics. In spite of this eternal plague that was Stealth Rock, good offense, good defense, Incineroar was a well-rounded Pokemon capable of doing most anything you needed to. Simple, but it never loses its effectiveness. An ideal Pokemon. It actually shared this tier with our worst of choice here, Decidueye, which once again wasn't a bad Pokemon, but it's certainly the least impressive that we've seen in a long time. It's kind of a strange case, because its stats were quite decent and its move pool quite impressive. It could go offensive with Nasty Plot and a great stab combination. It could go defensive and provide defog support. The problem was that not only did its stab struggle against Incineroar itself, and that's not even considering the ever nasty Pursuit weakness hanging over it, but more that its stats weren't quite as impressive as you thought they were. As a result, it wound up being kind of weak, kind of slow, and kind of frail. Relatively, of course. But while it wasn't any of these things in a vacuum, it had the bad habit of being all of these things relative to the job it was trying to do, which meant it had great difficulty in consistently carrying out whichever role it was tasked. And of course for VGC, Decidueye was once again the worst. Incineroar went on to become one of the greatest Pokemon of all time, and Primarina was largely outclassed by Tapu Fini in its debut generation, but it still had some usage to decent effect. Decidueye has zero notable placements in its debut generation. Sure, nobody was expecting Incineroar level viability from Decidueye, but its singles flaws carried over to VGC as well, and there just wasn't anything it could really do. No power, no bulk, no speed, and no utility. And at this point, it seemed like Game Freak was really pumping the starters up, because the Gen 8 starter trio packed similarities to Gen 4 and 6. Just like Gen 4, 2 of the 3 were superb in OU, and just like in Gen 6, one of them was so good it got banned, though the latter is less surprising given that it almost literally is Greninja V2. What makes Cinderace particularly interesting was the fact that it was banned twice, once in the Isle of Armor upon receiving Protean, Libero, which definitely isn't the exact same thing, and then again in the Crown Tundra after being unbanned thanks to the possibility of the expanded decks potentially keeping it in check, which didn't happen at all. Nope, it dominated for the same reasons it dominated before, because Omnistab as such a fast Pokemon is incredible. It sliced and diced its way through OU even more easily than Greninja, in spite of its Stealth Rock weakness, thanks to heavy duty boots, which basically turned it into Clefable as far as hazards were concerned. A Clefable that U-turned all over the place in a chain, with other switch move spamming teammates in an infuriating practice often referred to as the Vortex by the exasperated player base before coming back to destroy everything with Stab Pyro Ball and High Jump Kick, an unusual but terrifying heir to the firefighting starter legacy. Rillaboom wasn't far behind as far as viability went though, with the grassy terrain it summoned, not just powering up its Wood Hammer, but unlocking one of the best priority moves in the game, Grassy Glide, which hit as hard as Sucker Punch, and since it would always be in grassy terrain in order to unlock its priority, it would actually hit far harder. Whether Choice Band or Swords Dance, Rillaboom was an immense threat, especially since it too loved U-turning with the band set, and of course the terrain's passive recovery was immensely beneficial to its teammates, as was the Earthquake weakening effect. Inteleon, in comparison to these monsters, was very bland. It's strange because in and of itself, it seems incredibly frightening. Its special attack far surpasses Cinderace's attack, and it was even 1 base point faster. As far as pure water types go, you wouldn't think Inteleon would fall into the generic category. It's far too fast and strong. However, at this stage in the game, it's not nearly as impressive as its cohorts, not least because it somehow managed to be outbulked by Greninja. While Torterra lived in Infernape and Empoleon's shadow, it did so from UU, which is hardly shameful. Inteleon dropped all the way down to PU. Its saving grace is that it was too strong for the tier, getting itself banned to PUBL, but it's still not even close to the second best Pokemon, unfortunately. We can't emphasize enough how strange this is. It is wickedly capable of dishing out serious pain. Its standard water and ice coverage fleshed out by Dark Pulse to invite even more Greninja comparisons. Give this thing Protean or Libero and watch it thrash everything in sight, but as it stands, it's quote-unquote only a fast, powerful water attacker. It would have disassembled an older gen in a minute, but now pales in comparison to the greater depth and thus impact of its fellow starters. Inteleon is also the worst of its trio in VGC. As much like Greninja, it fails because being fast and strong isn't enough in and of itself. It's far from the one-hit KO machine it needs to be to overcome its frailty. And then again, that's less valuable in doubles as a whole, thanks to Protect. It doesn't provide any utility either. Meanwhile, Rillaboom's grassy terrain means it's absolutely excellent, and Cinderace, well, Cinderace isn't much better, but it does have higher placements, if even by a bit, though it and Inteleon basically fail for the same reasons. Fittingly, this video will now end how it started, with an unusual case. In Gen 1, we had Venusaur as the worst of the 3 in the tier they all shared, NU. Yet by virtue of the fact that it was actually by far the best in standard play, Blastoise wound up being the worst. Here we've got a similar deal, although it is also quite unique. At one point early in the gen, all 3 starters were viable in OU, which has never been the case before. Skeledirge was the best of them. It's unaware alongside tremendous bulk and a superb utility move pool, crucial in saving off boosting sweepers like Iron Valiant, but Meowscarada was quite ferocious as well, demonstrating that even though Protean had been nerfed, it could still wield it to superb effect, as it was even 1 base point faster than Greninja. Even Quaquaval, widely agreed to be the worst of the 3, was quite decent. It wasn't exactly Palafin Jr., but it did a fair approximation. Over time though, this has shifted. Meowscarada, initially thought of as destined for UU or less, has established itself as true blue OU, assisted by the addition of ice coverage and triple axle. Skeledirge retains a legitimate niche in OU, but isn't seen so much, and has dropped in UU where its tremendously synergistic dual stabs and Will-O-Wisp is very good. It's similarly an excellence to Quaquaval, except Quaquaval is even better. Its speed boosting stab Aqua Step is not just terrifying because it's a waterfall level power coming off of a base 120 attack that also makes it faster. It's terrifying satisfying because of how beautifully it synergizes with Moxie. Give Quaquaval an Aqua Step KO, and you've given it a Dragon Dance, and this is especially dangerous if it grabs a Swords Dance beforehand. Late game, it's lights out, especially with close combat and knockoff or triple axle flanking its coverage. So it seems like as great as Skeledirge is, it's going to be another unfortunate case of a solid Pokemon being the worst, right? Actually, no. You know how Venusaur was the best of its trio in OU? Well, Skeledirge goes even further. It's used in Ubers, and we're not just talking some technically it exists type of niche. No, Skeledirge is very much the real deal and has been from the beginning. It's used to check one of the most terrifyingly broken Pokemon ever, Koraidon. That's not all. It also checks Zacian Crown, and it takes on Extreme Killer Arceus. You know, just a couple of Pokemon that have been too much for Ubers before. It even takes on the viciously powerful Calyrex Ice. Quaquaval may be better than Skeledirge and UU, but Skeledirge is easily the best of the three in the most busted tier of them all. This leaves Meowscarada as the best in OU, and leaves Quaquaval as the one unfortunate enough to be the worst of the three, in spite of the fact that it's very good. Oh, and as if that's not bad enough, Quaquaval has a double whammy of also being the worst in VGC. Skeledirge is unaware and Will-O-Wisp carry it hard, even finding it usage in the restricted format, while Meowscarada found success early on thanks to its excellent speed and the power of its auto-crit Flower Trick, dangerous in the same way Urshifu Surging Strikes is. Meanwhile, Quaquaval is once again too much of a generic water, or more specifically, a generic offensive water, not suited for doubles play. It just takes too long to get its Aqua Step centered strategy working when it doesn't hit that hard or takes hits especially well. And with that concludes our ranking of every starter in their generation. Oh wait, I forgot something. Okay, this video will actually end with the second set of starters released as far as the mainline series is concerned, which is our benchmark in Generation 9. And I know that a lot of you would have commented that we missed the Hisuians, especially with Legends ZA coming out this year, to revamp the Johto trio. Yep, that's the Johto trio, alright? Yes, of course. Anyways, we're ranking the Pokemon Legends Arceus gang against each other, and not the rest of the Gen 9 starters, which seems the fairest. What seems less fair, though, is that Decidueye is really taking a beating here. Not only was its original form the worst in Gen 7, its Hisuian form became the worst in Gen 9 as well. There's no way it could compete with the OU-dominating, sharpness-boosted, ceaseless edge-spamming Hisuian Samurott, who has the strong Dark Stab that lays spikes as one of the most incredible weapons any Pokemon could ever have, and it's also got the eternal excellence of Water Stab on top of that. But sadly, Decidueye couldn't even compete with Hisuian Typhlosion, whose newfound Fire Ghost typing primed it for newfound ferocity. It was a stab combination comprised of two of the best stabs in the game for coverage and power alike. Not only did it unleash Shadow Ball with the same happy disregard for much everything else in the same way a Dragapult might, it could also wield the hazard-ignoring boots en route to launching full-powered eruptions. If it wasn't taking the more traditional Typhlosion route of throwing them around quickly with its trusty Choice Scarf anyway, what really made Hisuian Typhlosion a pain to deal with though was its signature move, Infernal Parade, a ghost move with 60 base power and a 30% chance to burn that doubled in strength against a status opponent. The synergy was just incredible, even if Hisuian Typhlosion's low bulk could get in the way of it. Overall, it was a very strong NU Pokemon. And where does the retooled Hisuian Decidueye stand in all of this? Well, at least it's not untiered, but it's close to it as it's in PU. It certainly doesn't have a shortage of potential weapons though. Its impressive base 112 attack is backed by Breloom's stab combination, including its signature move, the fighting type Triple Arrows, whose 90 base power is supported by some of the most seriously insane secondary effects possible. It has a 50% chance to drop the target's defense first of all, so switching into successive hits already proves to be a challenge. But it's also able to get a 30% flinch rate to bust past opponents even more easily, and it's got a high crit rate to boot. Oh, and it's got the Scrappy ability too, so you can't block it with a Ghost type. What more could you ask for? Well, better stats. Hisuian Decidueye is slow. This makes its laundry list of weaknesses particularly easy to prey on. It really pains us to crown Decidueye the worst again, but we're not the only ones who neglected its needs even while showering it with new toys. It's not even like it was good, it just happened to be the worst of a very strong trio. The second best Pokemon of the three is Anu after all. And to really hammer-arm the nail into the Cofagrigus, Hisuian Decidueye was also the worst in VGC. Its main competition here is Hisuian Samurott, since Hisuian Typhlosion is on a number of top teams for spamming Eruption. Hisuian Samurott has fewer placements than Decidueye, but when it does get used, it places much higher. Hisuian Decidueye's weakness-laden typing and low speed means it's difficult to leverage its good traits. Yeah, the 50% defense lowering effect seems nice when you compare it with a teammate to further abuse it, but it's just so difficult to pull off with any consistency, and is rarely ever really worth it. So as a result, Decidueye is the clear winner of this video, if that's what you want to call it. It wasn't just the worst in 2 generations, it was the worst in singles and VGC in both generations, making it the worst 4 times in a video format where the absolute max for most Pokemon is 2. Game Freak really knows how to make them, don't they? And thank you so much to our platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Megamon VGC, Nurse Jake, Jack G, Pretzel SP, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soares and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu for their major support of our videos.